Well, we're coming to the second part of chapter 5, and it's 8 pages, I think, of really, we could say, core ideas in Steiner's Christology that may need us to slow down. So I'm going to start off basically trying to give a précis of this last part, and then we'll get into some discussion. I was saying to Angus before we started, let's see if we get through the next paragraph today, because it's just some really big ideas. So in this next part, which is 5.2.2 in the thesis, it really brings in a second aspect of how the evolution of consciousness takes place, we could say. So in the first part, we talked about how a trinity or a collective of beings can unite their will in an inner imagination and an external will for manifestation. And so the three become one, or the 7 Elohim become one sun spirit, or the Logos in Steiner's world. And so this is another aspect to then how does it actually happen? How does an idea manifest itself into matter? Because that's part of one of the great riddles of humanity, is the whole, working together of spirit and matter and affecting each other. And so I've called this section Metamorphosis and Sacrifice. So we see how the Trinity is condensed through evolution, and that metamorphosis of consciousness takes place in these things. But it's a sacrificial service, a cosmic sacrificial service. And this sacrificial service, Steiner expresses as how what's required for consciousness to emerge. The emergence of consciousness requires a separation. So Christ is the central being who holds the Trinity's idea of humanity and offers through sacrifice the capacity for humanity to evolve. I'm just going to read the Steiner quote. As long as our earth forces were still united with the sun forces, as long, roughly speaking, as the sun did not shine on the planet Earth from outside, what we call consciousness could not come into being as part of the nature of Earth, nor could a soul or an astral body, which is the basis for consciousness, enter into the physical and life bodies. For consciousness to arise, a separation, a split had to happen. Something had to split off from the sun. So the separation, I suggest, describes a metamorphosis of consciousness through condensation of ideas into form and matter. Sorry, these are all very lofty statements. I suggest that this process in theological or religious terms would be called sacrifice. So where all the different aspects that we see of the divinity entering and into creation, creating complexity, requires a giving up of something right down into the incarnation of Christ, which we'll see later on. So this separation I've described takes place in 4 ways. So first, it takes place when a particular being or a group of beings has evolved enough to make the sacrifice willingly in connection with knowing what the intended outcome is, such as the Elohim. Second, through the condensation process. So this is bringing back in origin, the condensation of the fire souls. Some elements can no longer remain within the denser material forms. So when the condensation process happens, some more pure substances can't drop into matter, but have to separate, such as the sun elements needing to separate from the earth for matter of earth to appear. So that's a second principle. A third principle was through the need for something new to emerge, there is a higher guidance for some beings to change how they behave to create a separation consciousness. So that's theodicy, the emergence of forces of hindrance, coming about through a higher consciousness saying, look, create some resistance here, so that people can have a sort of an experience of themselves mirrored to them. Angus wrote before some of the theories of, is it Gödel's theories? Yep, which we can maybe come to discuss, that really show how this sense of incompleteness is necessary for a system to work properly. That's maybe my very simple interpretation, not knowing it very well. But the fourth step is, through each process of evolution of consciousness, a part of the emerging group who are taking on a consciousness will ascend to a new consciousness, while others remain at an earlier level and condense into a denser material form and reflects or maintains an earlier form of consciousness. This is a little bit how Steiner talks about the evolution of species, is that as certain species become more refined, a simpler form of that species remains behind and maintains a more animalistic or a more plant-like creature, and would bring in then our connection to the indigenous understandings of, the animals and the plants are our brothers and sisters, and we have a responsibility to them in their separateness, because they were a necessary sacrifice in this metamorphosis of consciousness. So that's a very interesting, far-reaching principle that we can have in looking at the next steps in consciousness. So I thought that would just be, it's not quite everything, but we will then go to the 5.3, the third part of this, this the pre-working or the pre-existence of Christ before the incarnation in Jesus of Nazareth, before what we know in the Gospels, in the sense of in the beginning was the Word, and how that reflects in simple terms, in mythopoetic forms, a working of the Logos before the incarnation. And how do we come to understand that? And this chapter, I suppose, really explores some of those principles of what I've called Steiner's, not his hermeneutical key, but his philosophical premise for his theology, which are these 4 steps. And this is about how Christ has worked in evolution, how Christ has worked in the development of human consciousness, and how the Christ impulse begins to work in the human being, so that the human being can then emulate through sacrifice, through selflessness, and through the imitation of Jesus, and later the imitation of Christ, these things. And so these are sort of archetypal principles. So these are sort of put in place in the spiritual world for us as human beings then to follow this process of incompleteness towards a telluric, I suppose, which will come in the 7th chapter, to the fulfillment of this journey through reuniting that what has been separated, what has been sacrificed. So we then look at this sort of this thing of, we're trying to understand this thing of Christ being fully, or the Christ Jesus being fully human and fully divine. And I suggest that we need to look at this what I think I brought earlier, is what would be a constructive way to critique and revision the heresies. So under the sort of the human hermeneutic of skepticism, saying it was all bad, and look what kind of lifestyles and what teachings they brought. Then also under the hermeneutic of grace, saying, if we look at some of the teachings and sort of rescue the constructive side of the teachings, and especially in this sense, 3 of those heresies are very helpful for us to understand this fully human and this fully divine aspect of Jesus and Christ. So I'm going to sort of elaborate, possibly in big theological terms, and try and bring them a little bit into an easier understanding. So the first heresy that we need to revise, or the first difficult teaching that we need to revise, is the Nestorian the Nestorian heresy of, that Christ and Jesus were two separate entities. And so Steiner follows the sort of the rejection of Mary as the Theotokos. In other words, that in the monophysite, in other words, that there was one hypostatic union where Jesus as a child became the Christ, or was the incarnation of Christ. So there's one being with two natures in one being, and that came through Mary. So he sort of questions that, just as Nestorius did. But he also agrees with a radical diaphysitism, which is a big word for saying that there are two natures in the union of the divinity of Christ with the human nature of Jesus. In other words, they are two beings in one nature. So a divine Christ with a human being, Jesus, who was born through Mary, and they come together in a long process through what Steiner calls the mystery of Golgotha, with these pre-earthly events bringing that long evolution of how these two beings can enter and unite with each other for the transformation, the metamorphosis of human nature. So then we also have the second concept, or difficult heretical concept, the Sabellian concept of modalism. In other words, this is a problematic because we sort of say the Trinity works, and modalism says God works in different ages in a different style. In an earlier age, this is a simplistic version, in an earlier age of working of God, we call it the Father God. Then a later age, the Son God aspect came into being and work, and now we sort of moving into the Holy Spirit mode of revelation, which kind of goes counter to saying that the Trinity are these three beings that have been learned to work as one. So how do we revise that? And the third factor is then the Valentinian Gnostic idea of the complementary qualities, or the syzygy. So the best way, or the easiest way for us today to understand that, is the yin and yang symbol, where two halves work as a or the Advaitic philosophy of the Indian philosophies, where it's not twoism. So it's not a monon, it's not a dualism, but it's two beings that work as one. So it's a non-dualistic syzygy, two halves that influence each other. So we look at that with the Trinity in a moment, about how that works. So how do we revise that? Those three things in the understanding of how those two principles of working together in the will of beings, but also through this idea of separation and metamorphosis, to allow spirit to express itself in matter, in that condensation that Origen and Steiner agree with. So then I go into trying to differentiate between the Logos and the Christ being. And I really want to I should go back a step there and say, what I come up with in this chapter is describing this kind of, well, I don't, but an author, Prothero, in his book, God is Not One, describes it as a modified Trinitarianism, or a soft monotheism, or a Trinitarian modalism. And I'll explain that now a little bit, how Steiner talks about this. But one of the things to try and differentiate is to see that the Logos, that Christ and Jesus are not just one, or not just similes for the same being. They are a description, or they are words used for different aspects of consciousness. So you have the Logos as the second aspect, or one of the aspects of the Trinity. You have the Christ as the Son Spirit, so the Spirit that is within the Son being. and you have Jesus as the being of in the human species that appears. And how do these three beings learn to work with each other in a unified way? So to understand that, we need to sort of understand how the three logoi, he calls them, the three aspects, so not the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which we call them, but Steiner, in a sort of esoteric sense, calls them the three logoi. And he said the third logos is so selfless that it lets its being sound through the world. The second streams forth in pictures or imaginations, and the first logos lets itself stream forth its own body, the substances. And this signifies the highest degree of selflessness, which is the Father principle, when a being is able to allow its own being to flow forth. That's the sacrificial aspect. And then we see how they sort of all work into each other. The first and the third radiate as a picture in the second. In the first, the second and the third stream forth in the essence. And at first, only the third logos is recognizable to us as humans. So this is, the word where we begin to understand. In the word, we have the hearing. The imaginations, in the pictures, we have the seeing, and then in the essence, we have also these three: the hearing, the sight, and the smell, the fragrance. So Steiner speaks of the first logos as being the aromas of the world, this fragrance of the world. And we see how this directly relates to the necessary for developing the spiritual senses as a transformation of the hearing, the seeing, and the sense of smell for us to begin to perceive the workings of these spiritual beings. So I'm going to try and get more succinct. So how do we see then these pre-earthly deeds of Christ? So Steiner tries to explain this being. I'm just trying to find it where I am. Yeah, so the pre-earthly deeds of the Christ is to see that as we work into the emergence of the human being or of matter, we come to a certain age in the evolution of consciousness where we have the separation. So we might have the Big Bang, and then we have the separation into the sun and the planets and the earth. I did have I might bring up a table that I had here. See if that shares. Does that table share? Yeah. So in that table there, we see the sort of the geological evolution timescale, Steiner's terminology, the biblical history, and then the chronology of the events going from the recent Big Bang, which goes from the Precambrian super aeon, which Steiner then goes through these ages: Polaris, Hyperborea, Lemuria, Atlantis, and then into our time, the post-Atlantean epoch, which really only starts from the end of the Ice Age. So our time, really, the Holocene epoch, starts with Noah, the end of the post-Atlantean epoch, about 8,000, 7,000 BCE, about 11,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. But before that, we have this emergence through the 6 days of creation. So we had this thing as, when was the beginning? In the biblical sense, this is really the Big Bang starts this first day of creation, the first 3 days of creation. Steiner talks about certain evolutionary steps that take place. And then we see the emergence of the Elohim with the separation of the sun which comes in that process. And then the separation of the moon, and we get the beginning then of, in the middle of Lemuria, Homo erectus, and in Atlantis, the Homo sapien, where we start to go through these evolutionary processes in the Proterozoic aeon, more specifically in the Triassic, Jurassic periods, where the human being begins to learn to stand upright, we learn to speak, and we learn to think. And this all takes place before the Ice Age, in a period that Steiner calls the Lemurian and the Atlantean times, where in these times, because of the evolutionary processes that take place in the human being, we have the separation taking place, and there are certain forces that are released, and the human being, these forces are wanting to, they are forces of hindrances that would take away these forces that are designed for the evolution of consciousness. And in that suffering, this being, we have to sort of go back then to the creation stories, where we see that in that separation of time where the sun separates, we see the sun spirit, the highest being of the sun being, who we call the Christ, undertook the spiritual guidance of humanity. It was a position, a rank that he took on. And they worked from the sun to drop a part of its essence into humankind. This essence would initiate the step from the communities of nations to a unal humanity by transforming the love held in the hereditary of blood to a universal love of the community of all humanity. You could say that's the internal intention of the mystery of Golgotha, to guide that. But we go back then to the time where we have, the eating of the apple, or what was known as the fall into sin. And Steiner interprets that slightly differently and says these beings we could see in the eating of the apple symbolizes, it doesn't, the apple also has the word malum in it, for evil, where we get to have the freedom to start to cognize and choose to follow good impulses or bad impulses. That's what it indicates. But Steiner says this so-called fall is where our consciousness now enters into matter through the desire to learn through individuation. So for Steiner, the concept of original sin is a way of trying to describe this change. It was a fall in that we entered the process of losing our consciousness of the spirit, a veiling, a condensing in a sense of origin, and our sense into the sense world, the physical world, which then, by the grace given through the deed of Christ Jesus, which he calls the Christ impulse, we could begin the corresponding unveiling or the unification of these things. So the pure fire mind, as Origen calls it, was kept in the spiritual world. So when this separation came, we have traditions like Dionysus being taken up into the thigh of Zeus, Adam Kadmon in the Kabbalistic tradition, and in Steiner's world, we call this the pure Nathan soul, where a certain part of the human image is kept in the spiritual world as a pure human soul. And this is what's really important for us to understand. This Adam Kadmon, Steiner calls it the pure Nathan soul, then begins to hear the cries of humanity and calls to the Christ being to unite with him. And 3 times in history, we see this time where the Christ and the Jesus being in the spiritual worlds unite and release forces into the human nature, so that this capacity to stand upright, which was implanted in our blood, this capacity to speak and learn language, and the capacity to think, are kind of given an impulse towards selflessness. So Steiner said, if we stand upright and we think of the sense organs, if the eye wanted to keep the light for itself, we wouldn't be able to function. So this work of the Logos and the Christ being and this pure Nathan soul of humanity undergo processes of transformation that imbue the human nature with gestures of selflessness, so that it can become a vehicle for an independent spirit to work in it. So the ongoing work of transformation of the human being is born of the profound suffering that the Nathan soul, this pure human soul, experiences through being the sister soul to the earthly human being. This suffering allows the Nathan soul to offer its existence to Christ forces repeatedly. So 3 times, and the 4th time in the mystery of Golgotha in the Bible, and thus transforms and allows the Christ to enter into his being. The Christ gives up or sacrifices the position of being the Son Spirit and enters into the being of the Nathan soul. And Steiner describes it similar to the baptism in the Jordan, except it happens at these 3 points in the spiritual world. And each time, an evolutionary step of the human being that was about to descend into chaos is drawn up and given its human nature. And so if the Christ had not sacrificed to join with humanity's destiny, the various aspects of our humanity would have remained chaotic and egotistical. And this is, saved by grace. This is the learning to be saved by the grace of Christ. And so I'm going to share again another table because it makes sense to look at this in tabular form. Just see if I can scroll down to it quickly to see that we can just get a picture of these 3 steps of, this is the end of the chapter really. Oh, come on. Here we go. So we see in late Lemuria, where the human being, where we get the uprightness in our sense organs, and they become where the Son Spirit, the Christ being, in his first pre-earthly deed, joins with the Nathan soul. In the sense, it's the expulsion from Eden, where the separation of the earthly Adam, so Adam and Eve, and the Nathan soul as part of the Adam Kadmon is taken up into the Son being, who then condenses and cools from the archetype mind to the archangelic mind through the first deed. So the Christ being, in a way, condenses his consciousness from being a son being to an archangel being. And in history, this is the stories of the Vedic story of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, or the giant Ymir in the Germanic mythologies. Then we have the second step, which is, in the speech, where the organs become selfless, and the second pre-earthly deed where the Christ joins with the Nathan soul again, and the Nathan soul joins, and the Christ being condenses from being archangelic in consciousness to angelic. And we see this in the Sphinx of the Egyptian and the Greek mysteries. So where we see, as we come closer and closer to the turning point in time where Christ incarnated in Jesus on the earth, we see these mythological stories, somewhere having perceived this work in the spiritual world and preserved them to mythology. And then the third step, where we learn language, where thought is expressed in language, we see the soul organs of thinking, feeling, and willing coming about, and they're imbued with a tendency towards selflessness. And this is where, we are incomplete. We are not yet selfless in our thinking, feeling, and willing. And this is at this point where Christ condenses himself from being an archangel or from an angel into a human consciousness, and it's preserved in St. George with the dragon. And we see these sun gods, Osiris, Apollo, Adonis, Mithras, Europa, Baldur, and the ear of Moses in the bush. These are all pictures of this third step where the Christ being is coming closer to being in the human form. And then the fourth step, which will be the content of chapter 6. And I think that is going to be pretty much, considering we've already done half an hour, I will stop sharing, and hopefully we can enter into some conversation about some aspects of that. How is that? Lots and lots, huge amount of concepts, sorry. I guess I can't hear you, sorry. Can't hear you, Angus. No,
now you can hear me.
Now I can hear you, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I turned off my mic. Wonderfully rich. I've got so many points that I'd like to make, but I'd like to actually invite Craig or Nick, it's like if they've got any questions, spontaneous reactions, because I'm possibly a lot more
You're
familiar
loaded
with
and
what
ready
you're
to
talking
go.
about. Yeah, exactly. And I
I'm
want
suffering from the same problem I do mostly, which is it's quite late at night on a Friday. So I'm really happy to hear your questions, Angus.
Okay, just before I do that, Craig, because you saw the email that I sent out a little bit earlier about Gödel, which Jude also referenced there, and I thought might also be of interest to you, Nicola, because
Yeah,
you've got a mathematical
yeah,
background.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
But, mm.
any reflections on that particular aspect? It's like this really key notion that Jude's talking about here right at the beginning of 5.22, that it's separation, condensation is another word that he used for it, that is so key to this process there. Thoughts, reflections?
I want to hear yours.
Okay. This is also just to make it a little bit more personal. My daughter, she's 18 years old. She's not like particularly like gifted in mathematics. She likes it. And
Mm.
she came home yesterday with a book about Gödel, and so we started talking about it. My basic understanding of why he is so interesting to anybody with a spiritual bent, basically, because he's challenging the limits of reason.
Mm.
Basically, he's proving mathematically that you cannot prove the the formal structures. I'd like you to correct me if I say anything incorrect here, Greg or Nicola, but basically there's an inherent deficiency in a model like defining itself. You can only to prove the correctness of a model, you have to step outside of it. So you've got this separation aspect coming in to that most material of sciences, mathematics. And
I don't
that's
think it
what I
is the
was
most
finding.
materialist of scientists, but yes, I've often seen that way. Yes.
Exactly. That's how it's interpreted. Exactly. Yeah. But perhaps you'd like to expand on that particular point. Why, and I agree with you, why you don't see it actually as being materialistic, although it's often perceived that way.
Well, because it's at its edges, it's full of paradox, and Gödel's theorem is one of those. I mean, and it holds sort of almost ideas about self-referencing and all those sort of things that consciousness, but mostly just the higher the higher levels of infinity and the paradox that is at its heart. It's not materialist at all. It really, I think mathematics holds within itself the critique of that, and in an exciting way. Yeah, yeah.
Did you want to add
I
anything
mean, but
there, Craig?
even ordinary
Sorry.
numbers are pretty mysterious, and I mean the fact that the solution to x squared equals -1 means something in physics is just absolutely mind-boggling. It's just, and not materialist at all. It's
Yeah,
spooky,
yeah, yeah. I mean,
And,
what I
and
liked
perhaps we can.
about the observations you made was that it sort of shows that incompleteness sort of reveals the meaning. It might be a very simplistic kind of interpretation, but this sense of paradox and the sense of that is true gives us the opportunity to find a new pathway towards meaning.
Mm.
And I think that's implicit then in Steiner's, and in mainstream theology.
Mm.
The mystery of God is about finding new ways to
Yeah,
become.
yeah.
We're not a complete system. I mean, to try
No,
and prove that we're a complete, meaningful, cohesive system
yeah.
is a false premise.
Mm.
Not that you're saying that. I'm not saying you saying that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so a reflection, building on that a little bit. When you were talking like in 5.2.2 there about, or 5.3, sorry, it was about Genesis in the first 6 days. Prior to looking at the table, and I'll come back to it where you presented that. This is one of the beauties of Steiner's cosmology. It's like leading us into Christianity for me, because a personal experience of that is, it's like I am integrating myself into the whole process of time. And so one way of describing that is, it's like my limited sense of a time being as like, I was born 55 years ago, and so like when I die, that's it. My whole experience of myself as a being, as I grow into these concepts, is I become an ever bigger time being. And moments can come where you actually experience yourself as a timeless being as you move into that. And I really love what you've done with the table there, because it helps us to move around more. So we've got these familiar concepts like the sun splitting off, which is like part of accepted science, or the earth separating from the sun, is how I should say it, but the Big Bang. So these are concepts that we are familiar with, but by placing them in this story where we are there at the beginning of time, this becomes something personal. It's not abstract and dead outside me. It's something that I integrate into my being. So yeah, I wanted to share that. That's one of the things that comes through from reading and rereading and rereading again what you've written here. How it's like it enriches our inner life. It's intellectually fascinating and complex.
Yeah,
but at the
and it's
same
paradoxical,
time,
which is, the maybe the theme of the day, because I think these are in my personal journey with Steiner over the last 40 years, coming out of the sort of very strong Catholic framework, or we could even say mainstream Christian framework, which really sees the consciousness of the human being coming into existence with the first breath, maybe at conception, depending on your stuff, that the soul of the human being, and therefore I was brought up thinking I didn't exist before conception. And Steiner turns that upside down. He says, hang on a second, no, if we look at the evolution of species in the mainstream form, and the evolution of consciousness, there's a reversal. So, and suddenly we see that since the beginning of time, or even before the beginning of time, the idea of the hierarchies in the spiritual world was to bring into existence this universe where the human being was, we say that, a central thought of consciousness. And at some point that needs an emergence of a physical emergence of species to happen. And so the sort of Darwinian, so-called Darwinian reading of evolution is also real, alongside this, humanity has always been implicit, and the driving imagination in it, and how the physical emergence of species takes place is a product of that separation. And I just find that mind-blowing to think that these two worlds can really inform each other mutually more and more, rather than, this is part of my critique in the PhD of anthroposophy, is they, in anthroposophy, or the sort of Steiner world, can be promoted that, the physical sciences don't really get it. This is the true picture. But when I read Steiner, I really see him always saying we have to let the physics and the mathematics and the spiritually and the psychological imaginations mutually inform each other to gain a full picture of reality. So otherwise you just become into an illusion, which is also not what it's about. For me, that's no use. So yeah.
Perhaps an image that I've been working with to reinforce, I think, what you're saying there, Jude. The scientific mind is directed outside. That's where we think we're going to find the truth, and we do find truths out there. But this process has to be turned around into turning. So like this activity of thinking that lives within us. This is just one example, okay? This activity of thinking, but it could also be feeling and willing, that lives within us. So when we first begin to investigate that, we are only discovering our own psychology. But then when we go beyond that, then there's this ability to recognize that these things that are living, they seem like externalized in my dreams and my visions and that type of thing, but they're all still just images of myself in a way. But within that self, you've got to way back out into the spiritual reality that's created that. So linking that back to your table there, and this process of Genesis, I think we can all recognize that as animals don't have this capacity to think that we do. There's some type of thinking going on there, but it's a very subconscious thinking. I mean, you throw a frisbee in the air and the jog, it doesn't know what it's doing, but it can still perform these like mathematically complex like processes to catch it perfectly. It's like in midair type of thing. But that which we're able to perform consciously, where did that gift come from? And once we start asking ourselves that question, rather than just using the tool of thinking to understand the outside world, and rather than being stuck in the self of, it's like this amazing, all this confusing richness of thinking, feeling, and willing that lives within our souls, we begin to move beyond that and say, yeah, but what is the source of that which allows me to think? What is the source of that which allows me, enables me to hear? And that's one aspect of what I see crystallizing out and giving us better access to, when you put in that tabular form there, where it's like well-known facts from that have been established in science. And it's like, yeah, and this is in a mythological sense. This is what is going on here, and then also in a Steiner cosmology,
and the biblical as well.
Yeah, really rich.
Yeah, just to add to that, I've found that like the tables are really, really helpful, because that's part of, I know what you're quite passionate about is breaking down the dogma and also helping people join the dots of these seemingly different silos. And in your, paper, there's a couple of sentences there which I'll read. You say Steiner argues that these names are all terms for different aspects of a being that comes into existence through evolution. And Steiner argues that the spiritual world and spiritual beings evolve along with the earthly world and earthly beings. And it's challenging to differentiate between descriptions of each spiritual being through their evolution. So, there's that aspect into the mix as well, not just what's kind of going on with Earth's evolution as well. So yeah, I find that even though there's a risk with trying to distill these complex concepts down into a table form, I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, I remember the moment where I think Nicholas said, "This is very complex," and I said, "Do you think a table would help?" And she went, a few.
It's still complex, I think.
It's still very complex, but tables do help. Yeah, but it is interesting, because what you sort of kind of bringing up there for me, Craig, is another complexity and paradox is, this traditional concept or expectation almost that God is perfect, all powerful, all loving, all knowing, therefore could stop tsunamis but doesn't, could influence political leaders not to run wars but doesn't. Why? All these moral questions of an all powerful, all pervading God. But in this model, even God is evolving. So through Christ working with the Nathan soul, his consciousness is morphing, it's changing, it's becoming more understanding of the human condition. One of the things that Steiner says is these divine spiritual beings don't know what it's like to live as a human being, isolated in a shell, with soul faculties that are limited and imperfect, and therefore prone to failure, etc., etc. And this being went through an evolution process and completely changed, and through the incarnation, brought a whole new capacity to the divine worlds, into the very essence of God's being. And that's mind-blowing. That's mind-blowing that the love that God emanates is transformed through Christ's and our experience of that, which becomes part of chapter 6 and 7, of course. But yeah, it really, this paradox and this movement that these tables bring up just really illuminate that for me, which makes it more complex, of course.
And also, again, I think I'm just re-emphasizing what you're saying there, using different words. This the problem of theodicy, it becomes resolvable.
Yeah.
Evil is this is one of my absolute favorite Goethe sayings of all time. Ich bin ein Teil jener Kraft, die stets das Böse will, aber das Gute schafft. I am that power which always wants evil but does good, or creates the good. And there's this beautiful feeling of wholeness about it that is fully reconcilable of the idea of the reality of a loving God.
Yeah.
But it's not just about it. It's about us waking up to God is in me and I am in God and I am in you. So this John 14 idea that ultimately there is no distinction. The distinction that we see is part of the process of knowing.
Yeah. I might just add there, so I think it's relevant, because we shouldn't, this whole idea of theodicy is a really contentious one, because its simplistic form would be evil is brought into existence at God's volition. And Steiner says that's far too simplistic. What he's saying is that, in that 5.2.2, where certain beings are aware of what's needed and are guided to create hindrance. So the God commanded effort into certain beings was to say, we need consciousness, we need human beings to become aware of themselves. So create a hindrance. And he brings, Cain and Abel there, where one sacrifice, two people are offering something up and one is rejected. And that brings about, why is mine not good enough? In a simple form, like Cain's going, why is my sacrifice not good enough? Because something's pushed back. So this theodicy at first is, Steiner says, establishing forces of hindrance to bring about self-reflection. Even God needed a sort of an earth to reflect to his being, where he needed more development.
On the seventh day, he appreciated it was good, but not before.
Exactly. And then how does evil emerge from that, which is, again, a further metamorphosis and separation process that allows certain beings who have already taken a step outside of the order of things, we could say, or into a particular place within the order of things, who then kind of go a different path with it and then become malevolent. So the evil beings are not God-willed, but they are a kind of a development. I mean, Nicola, I don't know where you've gone with your work on the development of morality and in the animal kingdom and all that, but where does a being go from being integrated into choosing not to be so integrated in the community? I mean, and this free will thing. And, did the angels or the beings who created the hindrance then go, you know what, I kind of like this. I'm just going to go my own path here. And so, yeah, evil is, Steiner's theodicy isn't, I need evil in the world. It's a progression of the separation through a metamorphosis of consciousness that then emerges. So it's a slightly more complex understanding of things. So what was necessary?
This would have happened with angels before humans.
Yeah. So, Abraham's offering of Isaac, Cain and Abel are all mythological stories of what happens up in the spiritual worlds, where in this activity of the angels condensing into sacrificing part of their being into another hierarchy so something new can emerge. The spiritual world said, okay, now refuse to receive that substance. And that was that, for the purpose of creating new consciousness, we need this process to have a damming up. So, yeah, and that then reflects itself down in the condensation processes into the mythologies, where, we could look at narratives and mythological stories where people meet resistance and become conscious because they have to step outside their life and look at themselves. Really, pretty much what you got to get outside your system to, you got to hit rock bottom to start, looking all those things.
Or what we might call a rupture of some sort.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Just a bit of wordplay there. It seems as you guys use the word rupture, the mind automatically also goes to the opposite, so which is rapture, which is also seeing from another perspective.
Yeah. The grace.
I do think this comparing ourselves with animals is incredibly fruitful for distinguishing. It's like how we are animal-like. And there are various stories about the importance of being able to name animals. They're not directly in the biblical tradition, but they circulate around it. That's this is the human capacity to actually to name the animals. It's it reflects two truths. One is that we are capable of doing something the angels aren't capable of, but it's also reflective of possibly the idea that it is by naming it, we're actually able to externalize it. Until we are able to actually name it, it just lives unconsciously within ourselves. So this naming process, which was so important for the scholastics versus the nominalists, in the Middle Ages there, this seemingly trivial act of being able to name something becomes something deeply profound, because naming something is a becoming conscious of something of which one was not conscious before, and i.e. it's growing beyond oneself.
Yeah. So this, that really names as this dynamic of, for all this to happen, you have to go through these constant things of separation, condensations, metamorphosis, reunion, new separations. It's kind of the mechanism by which this all happens, that matter and spirit can mutually influence each other. Because, this is in Steiner's cosmology, and I think, in Christian theology and most theologies, this is a fairly unique cosmos that we live in, where we are veiled from the spirit. We are separated. And, Genesis constantly brings about this duality. But it's the duality that then allows the grace to bring, the spiritual understanding through all those things you were naming, as something unique, that our hierarchy, let's not forget that our hierarchy has three aspects to it, which is human beings, the animals, and the plants, who are learning to understand what it means to evolve through matter. It's a fairly new experience and the guiding principle that is, chosen to do that in Steiner's world is the Christ being. The Christ being has chosen to, and we will meet that, you know, in the Galatians, you know, he sacrificed his role to become, you know, fully human and sacrificed it completely unto death. That's the archetype in that story, you know, the kenosis, the emptying out. Yeah.
What I'm also hearing you saying there, Jude, is that this idea, this Christian idea or Jewish Christian idea that this is the savior of the world. It is no exaggeration in the slightest. This is the Jews. So like when the prophets were talking about the savior of the world is coming, we're not talking about somebody with a tendency to hyperbole.
Yeah.
No, we are talking about that being which has acted 4 times in Earth history. It's like demonstrating that, and will continue to do so.
Yeah, exactly, which we'll come to. But also then that whole sense that salvation is not finite. It's not already completed. It's seeded, but now must evolve. And, you know, I think we all wish that, you know, we've been saved and therefore it is finished. But we need to participate. You know, the human being must participate in the salvation of our humanity. And I think, you know, that's not a new idea at all. But it's one that we often balk at as human beings. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to turn that recording off.